It was barely dawn when the knock came. The women had been lying on hard bunks for what felt like an eternity, counting the planks in the ceiling, whispering prayers into the wool of threadbare blankets. The spring light of the Midlands filtered through frost-rimmed windows, turning the air silver and still. A cold moisture clung to everything, the smell of damp wood mixed with the sourness of unwashed clothes. Somewhere outside, birds woke cautiously, as if afraid to break the quiet. Inside the corrugated barracks, every breath was shallow. Every ear strained for footsteps. The knock echoed again, not a crash of boots, but a gentle rap of knuckles on painted metal. 23 women froze. They were not soldiers in the sense their male counterparts were, but they had worn uniforms. They had operated telephones and telegraphs, typed coded messages, bandaged broken bodies. They had followed orders. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, they had been captured near the ruins of Bremen and shipped across the Channel to this British camp outside Nottingham. For days they had been told nothing. Their minds filled the silence with stories they had been fed, that British guards were brutes who stripped prisoners and paraded them naked through camps. In the trenches of Berlin, propaganda had promised horrors at the hands of the Allies, that enemies would take revenge on German women for years of war and genocide. On the march to the coast, rumours flew that the British would brand them with swastikas or shave their heads. They clung to each other in the darkness and waited for the promised humiliation. Now the door handle turned. Boots scuffed on concrete. Uniformed silhouettes appeared against the grey morning, their helmets and tunics unmistakably British. One of the women, a nurse no older than 19, instinctively clutched her coat to her chest and blurted in broken English, "We won't take our clothes off." Her voice trembled, defiant and terrified. The words hung in the damp air like frost. The men stopped in the doorway, startled, then something strange happened. Instead of jeers or orders to undress, they smiled. The sergeant, older, with weary eyes and a moustache flecked with grey, laid his rifle against the wall and lifted a basket. The smell hit them first. Fresh bread. Warm loaves with golden crusts and soft white centres, steam rising from between the napkins, like breath on a cold morning. Behind him, another guard carried enamel pots of tea, the spicy tang of black leaves and milk cutting through the stale air. One by one, he passed cups into trembling hands. "Breakfast?" he said in a calm Midlands accent. "It's a bit late because we weren't expecting ladies. No one's taking anyone's clothes off." For a moment the women did not move. Their hunger battled their shame. Crumbs fell onto the rough wooden table as they slowly reached for the offered food, eyes darting to one another for permission. A slice of bread melted against a tongue so long starved of butter that every nerve fired at once. The tea burned lips that had forgotten warmth, the tannins leaving a dry, pleasant aftertaste. Around them, the barracks walls remained the same, splintered planks, nails rusted by rain, yet with each sip the space softened. The crackle of the stove became comforting rather than threatening. A German radio operator looked down at her cup and began to cry quietly, tears leaving clean tracks on a face smeared with dirt. The sergeant pretended not to notice. He just kept pouring tea and saying, "There's plenty more where that came from." The women's fingers, numb from fear, warmed around porcelain. Outside, dew steamed off barbed wire fences as the first rays of sun lit up the English countryside. Fields stretched green and wet toward the horizon, hedgerows neatly trimmed, a patchwork of stone cottages and barns. It wasn't the barren wasteland they had been promised, nor was it a paradise. It was something else entirely. Normal. The taste of yeast and tea anchored them in this new reality. The knock at dawn, the feared harbinger of disgrace, had become an invitation to breakfast. The sharp smell of wood smoke replaced the stench of fear. The guards waited patiently, hands folded behind their backs. The women sat, ate, and wondered what else was a lie. Behind the steam rising from their cups, 23 pairs of eyes peered at the world, with equal parts dread and curiosity. They were a mosaic of Germany's wartime womanhood. One came from a Berlin suburb, where she had worked as a telephone operator in a bunker carved deep under the Reich Chancellery. Another had grown up on a farm near the Rhine and signed up as a typist to avoid conscription into a munitions factory. A third, with freckles and auburn hair, had been a nurse in an army hospital, binding limbs blown apart by artillery. The eldest was 37, the youngest just 18. Their accents betrayed origins in Saxony, Bavaria, Prussia, and the Ruhr. Some carried photographs sewn into their uniform linings, a baby's smile, a snow-covered church steeple, a fiancé in uniform. Others clenched empty fists because the hurried evacuation from Bremen had left possessions strewn across muddy roads. They had marched through the shattered skeletons of cities and boarded a ship in the dark, the taste of salt and diesel heavy on their tongues. Now they found themselves in England, staring at men whose faces were lined with fatigue, but not hatred. The men were equally ordinary. The sergeant with the grey-flecked moustache had calluses on his hands from years as a carpenter before the war. His Midlands accent drew out vowels so that T became Tay. Another guard had sandy hair cropped close to his head and a small scar above his left eyebrow where his young daughter had caught him with a toy. The older one smoked a pipe that smelled of cherry tobacco, a scent alien and exotic to the women's noses. The younger wore a wedding band carved from cheap tin because rationing made gold impossible. Their uniforms were neat but patched. When they spoke among themselves, the women caught words like ration book, coal, wife, and realised these men were also exhausted by years of sacrifice. The propaganda had painted them as monsters. Instead, they looked like neighbours you might pass on a village street. That realisation unsettled the women more than any threat. Beyond the barracks, the camp unfurled in a pattern of angles and curves. Wooden huts, arranged in rows, gravel paths cutting between them, tall watchtowers at each corner where sentries stood silhouetted against the sky. The barbed wire fence, 3 strands thick with coiled razor wire at the bottom, hummed when the wind blew. Beyond the wire lay a landscape that seemed impossibly green. Oak trees dotted distant fields. A herd of sheep grazed, their wool matted from morning dew. A thin plume of smoke rose from a cottage chimney, carrying the faint scent of roasting meat, or perhaps just damp wood. It was an English countryside painting come to life, but the women saw it through the frame of metal and war. That morning, as they sipped tea that scalded their tongues, a robin landed on the wire and sang. The note held steady, unconcerned by human fears. For a brief second, a radio woman closed her eyes and let the sound sink in, a reminder that life continued beyond propaganda and conflict. Before the war ended, they had lived in a world of slogans and secrets. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, had been the official creed for German women. In rallies and on the pages of women's magazines, Adolf Hitler declared that a German woman's world was her family and house. Yet as the war dragged on and the Wehrmacht bled away on the Eastern Front, the regime quietly shifted. Hundreds of thousands of women were drawn into auxiliary roles: telephone, telegraph and transmission operators, administrative clerks and typists, operators of listening equipment and searchlights. Nursing, meteorology, messengers, tasks once deemed masculine now fell on slender shoulders. By 1945, roughly 500,000 women served as Wehrmachtshelferinnen, half volunteers and half compelled by mandatory service. They wore uniforms without the status of soldiers, obeyed orders without the promise of glory. Propaganda called them Blitzmadels, lightning girls, and showed them smiling under headphones or rolling bandages. Reality was grimmer. They slept in cold barracks, ate thin soup, and listened to bombs while relaying messages about cities burning. Their uniforms were often 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with belts fashioned from rope. In the evenings, huddled around tin stoves, they swapped rumours gleaned from overheard conversations. Some claimed that female anti-aircraft auxiliaries were being praised in Berlin, while others whispered that U-boat personnel had begun to deploy sea witches, women operating sonar equipment in cramped underwater compartments. The line between myth and reality blurred as fatigue and censorship deepened. The propaganda machine prepared them for what might come if Germany lost. Newsreels whispered of Allied atrocities. Leaflets dropped on factory floors insisted that British and American troops were ravenous for revenge, that they would ravage women and force them to labour until they dropped. Elderly neighbours recalled the hunger after the First World War and shuddered. "They will treat you like the Jews," a woman in Hamburg told a young radio woman as sirens wailed overhead. Rumours flourished that the British would brand Germans with swastikas in mimicry of the Star of David. Others swore foreigners would be allowed to loot and pillage without consequence. The security service reported that many Germans interpreted Allied bombings as retribution for Kristallnacht and concluded that the victors would exact the same cruelty. Fear fed discipline. Diaries from early 1945 reveal a mindset shaped by doom. Edeltraut G., a young woman working in an army office, wrote that she could simply not imagine how it might be if the enemies take Germany by storm, and wondered what the next year would bring. In April and May, Magdalena M. scribbled dark images of a future she dared not picture, while Lily H. confessed she had nothing to look forward to. The inability to conceive of life beyond Hitler led some to suicide. In their minds, surrender meant rape, starvation, and annihilation. When the Soviets pushed into East Prussia and stories of mass sexual violence spread, these fears hardened. Even as defeat loomed, Nazi propaganda insisted that only total war could prevent a fate worse than death. Newsreels showed charred villages and whispered of Asiatic hordes, raping and plundering, stoking racialized terror. Rumours circulated that American troops would deploy Negro units, specifically to punish German women, playing on deeply ingrained racist propaganda. In canteens and barracks, officers repeated the slogan, "Better to die on your feet than live on your knees." Those who doubted were accused of treason. The fear was enforced not only by speeches, but also by the intimate environment of every workplace. In the communications bunkers, supervisors pinned caricatures of Allied soldiers to bulletin boards, grotesque British with crooked teeth and leering eyes, American GIs with dark skin, and cartoonishly large hands. Beside them hung memos warning women to lock themselves in if their post was overrun, because capture meant certain violation. Clerks like the ones now eating breakfast in Nottingham were told, "If you leave your post, the Tommies will chase you like rabbits." Young radio operators wrote in their diaries that they could hear Soviet voices on the airwaves at night and imagine those voices creeping into their rooms. Fear seeped into dreams. One typist dreamt repeatedly of her hair being cut off and burned while villagers laughed. Another saw herself branded with a swastika on her forehead. None of this came from direct experience. It was planted by a state that depended on terror to keep its citizens fighting. This indoctrination clung to the group of 23 women as they marched through bombed-out villages toward the Channel. Among them were telephonists from an air raid warning centre, clerks from an anti-aircraft battery, a medical orderly who had volunteered with the German Red Cross, and a wireless operator from a Luftwaffe base. Some had believed wholeheartedly in the cause. Others had joined out of necessity, lured by a steady ration. All had consumed years of rhetoric painting the British as decadent and vengeful. When a farmer along the road shouted, "Hurry up, the Tommies will soon make you their whores," their cheeks burned. An older NCO hissed at him to shut his mouth, but the words stuck. Under ration blankets at night, they whispered about what awaited them across the sea. "They will shave our heads," muttered one. "They will parade us," said another. No one suggested the possibility of kindness. The morning after the knock, the guards returned. This time the sergeant brought a stack of clean towels and gestured toward a separate wooden hut near the barbed wire. "Bathhouse," he said. "Ladies first." The women exchanged wary glances. One of them muttered the familiar promise again, "We won't take our clothes off." The sergeant shook his head with an amused sigh. "There are cubicles in there," he explained. "Privacy. Fresh water. We'll stand outside." Uncertainty flickered across the women's faces. They had been living in the same uniforms for weeks, sweat and smoke embedded deep in the fabric. The prospect of warm water was as irresistible as the fear of exposure was strong. Inside the bathhouse, steam rose from galvanized tubs. The air smelled of lavender soap and pine. Each cubicle had a curtain. The Geneva Convention required separate dormitories and conveniences when women were housed alongside men, but these women had never expected such regulations to be honoured. Tentatively, they undressed behind the curtains, each button undone with shaking fingers. Under the water's warmth, their muscles unclenched. Dirt spiralled down drains like dark memories. The sensation of being clean felt almost luxurious after weeks of sleeping in lice-infested uniforms. One woman, who hadn't seen her own skin without grime since the crossing, stared at herself in the small mirror and noted the hollows under her collarbones. Another traced a scar on her forearm where a splinter from a collapsing ceiling had cut her. Behind thin wooden panels, they whispered to each other, trading jokes to mask vulnerability. One sang a snatch of a childhood song about rivers and meadows, and her voice echoed strangely in the humid space. One by one, they emerged wrapped in rough towels, cheeks flushed pink. The guards were outside smoking and looking studiously away. "See?" the sergeant grinned. "No one wants to see your knickers." Awkward laughter bubbled up. For the first time since surrender, some of them smiled. As they walked back to their barracks through the crisp morning air, their damp hair steaming, the sunlight warmed their shoulders. They caught glimpses of male prisoners across the yard, men wearing faded field grey, busy splitting logs. The men glanced over, but quickly returned to their tasks. There was an unspoken agreement not to stare. At the pump, the women filled tin buckets and splashed water over the wooden steps, watching it run in rivulets through the dust. Normality, or something like it, crept back, carried on the simple act of washing. Breakfast that day was porridge thick with oats and raisins. The women sat at long tables on benches, spoons clinking. The camp cook, a middle-aged man from Manchester, ladled extra scoops without being asked. Under the Geneva Convention, food rations were supposed to be sufficient in quantity and variety to keep prisoners healthy. Here, the British adhered to that principle despite rationing for their own civilians. Fresh vegetables from a nearby allotment appeared twice a week. There was even jam when the Red Cross delivered parcels. The women were astonished. At home in Germany, their families queued for hours for a few potatoes or a slice of bread. In the camp, there was sugar for tea, salt for seasoning, even the occasional biscuit. "Is this because we are women?" whispered one clerk. "No," replied the nurse, stirring her bowl. "It's because they have not been bombed into dust." After breakfast, a British doctor arrived, stethoscope around his neck. A German-speaking matron accompanied him. "Routine," she explained. "We check weight, lungs, any injuries. There is an infirmary if you need it." She looked at the radio operator's bandaged hand and gently unwrapped it to clean the wound. Article 29 of the Convention required detaining powers to take sanitary measures and provide medical care, but again, the women had doubted paper promises. The doctor examined them one by one, noting a cough here, an infection there. He arranged for extra blankets for those with chills and issued iron tablets. "You've been through it," he said softly, switching from English to hesitant German. "But you're not animals." At the word animals, the nurse flinched. She had worked in a field hospital near Warsaw and seen the consequences of dehumanization. The irony of receiving compassion from an enemy made her throat tight. Health checks became a fortnightly ritual. The doctor listened to hearts and lungs, weighed each woman and recorded the numbers in a ledger. Article 31 required monthly medical inspections, but in this camp they happened more often. The nurse volunteered to assist and found herself translating symptoms, learning the names of ailments in English. She repeated throat and chest as she pointed, and the doctor smiled at her efforts. He taught her temperature, pulse, injection, turning medical care into language lessons. When one woman developed a persistent cough, the doctor arranged for her to sleep in the infirmary, a warm room with white sheets and windows that opened to the sound of leaves rustling. He gave her cod liver oil and allowed her companions to visit, carrying trays of soup carefully so as not to spill. At night, they heard owls hooting, a sound absent from the bombed cities they came from. Another woman suffered nightmares and woke screaming about bombing raids. The matron sat with her until dawn, holding her hand in silence. Over time, the screams lessened. In the quiet of the infirmary, she confided that she had been at Dresden when fire turned air to flame. The British nurse squeezed her hand and whispered, "I'm sorry." It was the first time anyone from the other side had acknowledged her trauma. On another occasion, a woman fainted while peeling potatoes. Her face went ashen and she slid off the bench. The doctor diagnosed anemia and arranged for extra meat rations. He sent her to lie down in the shade of a tree while the others continued their chores. She lay on the grass, looking up through leaves flickering in sunlight, and thought of the cinders that had filled the sky months before. The contrast made her chest ache. Daily routines soon formed. At dawn, the bugle sounded. The women filed out to roll call, the crunch of gravel under boots. They were counted and dismissed, then returned to their barracks to sweep floors and shake out blankets. They learned the smell of wet wool drying on ropes, the metallic tang of tin cups, the earthy scent of coal smoke from the cookhouse chimney. They were given chores, peeling potatoes in the kitchen, mending uniforms, cleaning latrines. Some were assigned to tend vegetable patches, their fingers sinking into rich soil after months of concrete and rubble. The camp commandant insisted on order but rarely raised his voice. He explained rules with measured words. No attempts to escape, no fraternizing with male prisoners, no leaving the compound. Those who obeyed would be treated fairly. Those who broke rules would face confinement. At first, the women still expected hidden cruelty. When a British corporal asked them to help unload a truck of blankets, a petite telephonist stiffened, anticipating a trick. Instead, he simply handed her one end of a bale and hoisted the other himself. When she struggled under the weight, he slowed to match her pace. "Easy does it," he said, not unkindly. Later, when he lit a cigarette, he offered her one. She declined, unused to such familiarity. That evening he delivered a stack of letters. Each envelope bore a British stamp and a scratchy pencil scrawl from home. The camp's mailroom had finally received word from Germany. Tears welled as they recognised familiar hands. A mother's loops, a husband's angular strokes. News of bombed streets and missing cousins poured across pages. Several discovered that their towns had been destroyed entirely. The smell of bread and soap now mingled with the metallic tang of grief. Weeks stretched into months. The shock of capture faded. In its place settled a complicated existence defined by monotony, uncertainty, and unexpected gentleness. The women were assigned to a barracks just for them. The walls were thin, and the wind whistled through gaps. But there were iron beds with mattresses stuffed with straw. They hung photographs from home on nails and decorated lockers with pressed flowers from the fields beyond the wire. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, they had separate toilets and washing facilities, a privilege denied to many male POWs in more crowded camps. Each morning after roll call, they cleaned their quarters meticulously. They took pride in polished boots and tidy bunks. Order gave them control in a world turned upside down. Food remained a defining sensory experience. Rations changed with the seasons. Summer brought cabbage and carrots grown in the camp gardens. In autumn, apples appeared in their bowls, sharp and sweet. Meat was scarce, but once a fortnight a stew simmered on the stove, filling the barracks with rich aromas. On Sundays, they were given a slice of cake. They ate slowly, savouring each bite, mindful of how their families had little. Article 26 mandated that rations prevent nutritional deficiencies. The British cook went beyond the bare minimum. He added herbs to soups and carved crosses into bread loaves before baking them. He joked with the women in fractured German and taught them English words for ingredients: carrot, onion, gravy. In return, they taught him to swear in their dialects. Laughter drifted across the yard like smoke. Beyond sustenance and health, the women were exposed to something even more disorienting: education. The camp commandant believed in re-education, a program introduced across the British POW system to demonstrate the principles of freedom and democracy. In the wooden recreation hall, they were invited to attend lectures delivered by civilian professors and officers. A weekly German-language newspaper, Wochenpost, was circulated among prisoners. It reported news of the Nuremberg trials, articles on parliamentary government, and essays about the dangers of fanaticism. At first, the women refused to read it. They saw the paper as propaganda from the other side, but boredom and curiosity wore down resistance. They flipped through pages, laughing at unfamiliar cartoons and frowning at accounts of concentration camps. A librarian, a British private with spectacles and a gentle manner, showed them shelves of books. There were Goethe and Schiller in German, but also translations of Dickens and Austen. When asked, he explained the difference between monarchy and constitutional monarchy. They listened, sceptical yet attentive. One evening he screened a newsreel about parliamentary debate. The voiceover explained that members of parliament could criticise the government without fear. A telephonist whispered to the nurse, "Imagine saying what you think out loud." As weeks passed, the women embraced the camp's cultural life. They wrote short pieces for a camp magazine and taught each other songs from different regions. These communal experiences, though simple, fostered solidarity and opened horizons beyond the narrow slogans they had been fed. They attended lectures delivered by visiting professors and officers about subjects like the Magna Carta and electoral law. The discovery that citizens could criticise their government and vote even in wartime unsettled and intrigued them. In the evenings, they argued about whether such ideas could fit into German society, borrowing books from the camp library to fuel debate. Holidays were modest but meaningful. They cut a small pine for Christmas and decorated it with handmade ornaments. British guards joined in singing carols, and for a brief time, German and English voices wove together. The cook improvised a pudding from dried fruit and suet, and small gifts exchanged under lamplight reminded them that joy could survive captivity. Relationships with their captors remained formal but warmed. The sergeant who brought bread on the first morning became their primary point of contact. He told them about his wife in Nottingham, his children, and their ration books. He said he was tired of war. One evening he confided that his brother had been killed in North Africa in 1942. "We're all paying for this," he said, staring at the dying embers of a cigarette. The nurse surprised herself by placing a hand on his shoulder. In that moment, uniform colours seemed irrelevant. Another guard, younger and more cynical, joked that the women should teach him German so he could order beer properly. They obliged. In return, he smuggled a harmonica into the barracks and played folk tunes that reminded the women of Bavarian mountains. On rainy nights, they sang quietly along, voices blending with the soft reed notes. Not all days were gentle. Letters continued to arrive, bringing news of devastation. One woman learned that her sister had been killed when an Allied bomb hit their village church. Another discovered that her fiancé, a Panzer commander, had died in the last days of fighting. Grief cut through the calm of camp routine. On those days, the barbed wire seemed to hum with tension. Women sat on their bunks, eyes distant, clutching crumpled letters. British guards, unsure of how to comfort, offered extra tea. The nurse realised that kindness did not negate loss. She carried both in her chest, like two hands clasped tightly. They also volunteered for tasks beyond their assigned chores. They helped mend fences, tended a flock of chickens, and joined British guards in stacking hay. Performing practical work outside the barracks gave them a sense of agency they had not felt before. Their confidence grew to the point that they wrote a thank you letter to the Nottingham Town Council for sending extra blankets. To their surprise, the mayor replied with a photograph of his daughters playing in the snow and a note expressing hope for Germany's future, a small exchange that reinforced the power of mutual respect. Moral reversal. As summer turned to autumn, the women's sense of the world shifted. The idea that their captors would strip them and parade them seemed not only false, but absurd. The memory of shouting, "We won't take our clothes off," now made them smile. Instead of humiliation, they had received bread, tea, privacy, and care. The propaganda that had once filled their dreams with nightmares lost its grip. They began to speak openly of deception. Sitting on the barrack steps in the soft evening light, they compared memories of speeches and posters to the reality of camp life. "Do you remember when they told us the British would tattoo us?" laughed the telephonist, showing her unmarked arm. "They said the Americans would force us to scrub toilets with our tongues," replied the nurse to general groans. The re-education classes that once felt intrusive now sparked curiosity. The women debated with visiting speakers, questioning details of parliamentary procedure and the role of women in democracy. A British lecturer explained that in Britain the vote had been extended to women in 1928. Silence fell as the women absorbed this. Some felt anger. Why had their own country insisted on their submission while calling them to serve? Others felt hope. They wrote letters home describing these discussions, gently challenging the narratives they had grown up with. One wrote to her mother that not all Britons were weak. Many were ordinary people who wanted peace. Another wrote that she had seen newsreels of liberated concentration camps and could no longer believe that Germany had been defending civilization. These were dangerous thoughts to send across censors, but she could not stay silent. She signed her letter, "Your daughter, learning." Stories circulated among the women about other camps. They heard of harsh conditions in Belgium where prisoners went hungry, and of Soviet camps where death rates were terrifying. They realised that by accident or design, they had been spared the worst. The Mashka Commission later concluded that no other victorious power invested as much effort in re-education as Great Britain. Even critics admitted that Germany's prisoners in Britain were ahead of their compatriots in rebuilding democratic values. The women saw this in their own lives. They felt themselves becoming bridges between worlds, products of a defeated nation, yet carriers of something new. Some embraced this change eagerly. The nurse, who had once derided British democracy as weak, now devoured works by philosophers she had never heard of. She translated passages for her comrades, her hands ink-stained from the borrowed fountain pen. Others resisted, clinging to the comfort of certainty. One typist insisted that the lectures were simply a new kind of propaganda. "They want to make us forget who we are," she whispered at night. Her bunkmate replied softly, "Maybe we need to decide for ourselves who we are." The conversation hung in the darkness, unresolved. The camp's moral universe inverted itself in small, powerful moments. When a British guard slipped on ice and fell, his rifle skidding across the yard, several women rushed to help him up without thinking. He laughed, embarrassed, and thanked them. When a German woman fainted in the garden, a guard carried her to the infirmary in his arms. Later, she confided that she had imagined such a position only in nightmares of abduction. The reality of being cradled gently confused her. Compassion flowed in unexpected directions. These shifts were not only emotional, but practical. The women began to take more responsibility for their living space. They formed a committee to liaise with the camp commandant about needs and grievances. They requested materials to sew underwear because the ones they had were wearing thin. The commandant granted the request. They organised reading circles, teaching each other to read the English alphabet. They learned songs from each other's regions, creating a mosaic of dialects. They started to plan what they might do after the war. "We must rebuild," said the nurse, "but rebuild differently. No more blind obedience." Her words settled into the group like seeds in fertile soil. In early 1946, orders came down from London. Repatriation would begin. Germany was in ruins, and the Allies needed to release labour to start reconstruction. But the process would be gradual. Some prisoners, particularly those considered political or technical assets, would be held longer. For the 23 women, the news produced conflicting emotions. They longed to see their families, to smell the smoke of their own hearths and taste water from familiar wells. They feared what waited. Letters described collapsed buildings, looted farms, empty chairs at kitchen tables. They had grown accustomed to regular meals, to safety behind barbed wire. They knew they would return to a defeated country, struggling with guilt, grief, and hunger. The statistics whispered by visiting lecturers played in their minds. Around 400,000 German POWs were held in Britain in 1946. By 1948, most would be home, yet some 25,000 chose to remain in Britain voluntarily. That number fascinated them. It meant that tens of thousands of their compatriots found something in Britain that they preferred to the ruins of home. It raised questions. Did those men marry English women? Did they join trade unions? Did they plant gardens like the one behind their barracks? The idea that one could choose to stay with former enemies seemed both radical and strangely logical, given the humanity they had encountered. Farewells began with bureaucracy. Each woman underwent a final medical check and received an official certificate listing any treatments received. They packed their few possessions, letters, a harmonica, a book of Shakespeare plays, a pressed flower. The sergeant came to say goodbye. "Safe journey," he told them in German. "Tell them over there that we're not monsters." His voice broke slightly. The nurse hugged him impulsively. He stiffened, then returned the embrace, patting her back awkwardly. "If you ever come to Nottingham," he joked, "I'll buy you a pint." She laughed and promised to write, though she knew she might not. The journey back was bittersweet. They boarded a train at Nottingham Station. Local civilians watched with curiosity as the column of German women in faded uniforms marched past. Some Brits nodded politely. A few spat. On the train, they sat on wooden seats and stared at the English countryside rolling past. Hedgerows, stone cottages, church steeples, children waving from platforms. Elderly women in shawls watched them with a mixture of curiosity and pity. A girl about 6 held up a doll and made it wave. One of the German prisoners waved back, tears pricking her eyes as she remembered a niece she had never seen. The train passed through industrial towns where chimneys belched smoke and men in flat caps rode bicycles to factories. The contrast to bombed Germany struck them even before they crossed the sea. When the train paused in London, they glimpsed St. Paul's Cathedral rising from a maze of streets. It had survived the Blitz. Its dome shone, a symbol of resilience. They wondered what symbols Germany would have. They crossed the channel in a ferry, the sea slate grey and choppy. Seagulls wheeled overhead. Salt spray dampened their coats. Some women retched, unaccustomed to the rolling motion. Others leaned against the rail, letting the wind whip their faces. For the nurse, the crossing evoked the journey in reverse months earlier, when she had been crammed into the hold of a ship in darkness. Now she stood on deck, watching white cliffs recede, and felt both freer and more burdened. As the coast of France appeared, a weight settled in their chests. On the train through Belgium and into Germany, the devastation became undeniable. Towns were heaps of bricks. Factories were twisted skeletons. Bridges lay in rivers like broken bones. Smoke rose from makeshift chimneys poking out of cellars turned into homes. Civilians in threadbare coats scavenged among ruins, their faces hollow and grey. Children with swollen bellies played with rubble as if it were toys. The stench of smoke and sewage hung in the air. When the train passed through her hometown, the nurse recognised nothing. The station had collapsed. Her street was gone. Only the church steeple, blackened and cracked, marked where her life had been. She pressed her forehead against the glass and sobbed silently, not wanting strangers to see her fall apart. Reunion with family was equally complex. Mothers cried and held daughters tightly, feeling ribs through uniforms. Fathers, gaunt and resigned, offered weak smiles. "You are alive," whispered one over and over. Brothers looked away, ashamed of their own survival. Some families greeted the women with suspicion, wary of what they might have learned. Others peppered them with questions. "Are the English devils?" asked a neighbour. "No," replied the telephonist. "They gave me bread." The women discovered quickly that their experiences made them outsiders at home. In bombed kitchens, they spoke of British lectures on democracy and were met with silence or ridicule. "They brainwashed you," said an uncle. "We lost because we were betrayed." The nurse refused to argue. She instead volunteered at a local hospital, using the skills she had practiced in the camp infirmary. She bandaged wounds with efficiency and gentleness, remembering the British doctor's steadiness. The telephonist joined a reconstruction committee in her town, advocating for women's voices in rebuilding. She quoted ideas she had heard at Wilton Park, that democracy required participation and that silence was complicity. Some villagers listened, others turned away. Some of the women channeled their camp experiences into quiet activism. They joined reconstruction committees and women's groups, advocating for schools, libraries, and fair pay. The lessons of the camp, to question authority, to read widely and to value consensus, guided their efforts. They were not revolutionaries, but they contributed to rebuilding a society on more democratic lines. Not all stories ended with activism. One of the women withdrew into domesticity, unable to reconcile her time in captivity with the expectations of her village. She married a farmer, bore 3 children, and rarely spoke of Nottingham. Yet on winter evenings, when her husband was out in the barn and the children were asleep, she would take out a tin cup she had kept from the camp and run her fingers around its rim. Memories of bread and warmth would flood back. She would whisper the English words she had learned: tea, friend, freedom. Tears would fall silently into the cup. Years passed. The women corresponded sporadically with the sergeant and the camp librarian. Letters travelled slowly across still-scarred Europe. One by one they married or remained single, had children, or chose not to. The nurse eventually returned to England in 1955 with a delegation of German medical professionals. She visited Nottingham and found the sergeant working in a shop, hair now white. They hugged and cried. Over tea they reminisced about porridge and harmonica tunes. "We thought you would hurt us," she told him. "We were told you were animals." He laughed softly. "We thought the same about you." The absurdity of 2 peoples who had hated without knowing each other hung between them. They lifted their cups and drank. Others retreated into domestic lives, cherishing the memory of warm bread and simple kindnesses. They taught their children to question slogans and to remember that humanity exists even in unlikely places. The knock on the door echoes through history. To those 23 women, it was the sound of an ending and a beginning. It was the threshold between propaganda and reality, between fear and understanding. War makes monsters of nations. It also makes neighbours of enemies. In a corrugated hut under an English sky, women who had been taught to hate and men who had been taught to despise found common ground in bread, tea, and shared humanity. The Geneva Convention's clauses on separate dormitories and sufficient food were not abstract legalities, but lived experiences. Re-education was not brainwashing, but an invitation to think. There are lessons in their story that transcend time. Propaganda thrives on isolation. It demonizes the unknown, filling gaps in knowledge with fear. The Nazi regime told its women that surrender meant assault and humiliation. It showed them images of British decadence and Soviet brutality. It withheld information about its own crimes. In that vacuum, rumours of revenge blossomed. The reality the women encountered disrupted those narratives. Kindness from an enemy does more than ease hunger. It challenges identity. It forces a re-evaluation of who is us and who is them. When the nurse bandaged a British guard's finger and he smiled in gratitude, she became both prisoner and caregiver. When the telephonist argued about suffrage with a lecturer, she exercised a freedom she had never known. The moral reversal did not erase the horrors committed by Germany or the hardships inflicted by war. It illuminated a different path forward. Peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of empathy. The British could have treated the women harshly and still satisfied legal requirements. Instead, they chose to exceed them. They offered bread warm from the oven when their own citizens still lived under rationing. They allowed laughter in a barracks built for obedience. They taught poems and songs. They acknowledged pain. They did not strip their prisoners of dignity, and in doing so, they preserved their own. The women reciprocated by peeling potatoes, sewing undergarments, and, eventually, questioning the ideology that had shaped them. In these exchanges, humanity bloomed like the flowers they pressed between dictionary pages. The knock will come again, in different forms and to different people. It may be the arrival of refugees at a border, the release of prisoners from a detention centre, or the first meeting between rival factions after a ceasefire. Each time, there is a choice: to perpetuate fear or to offer bread. History suggests that revenge perpetuates cycles of violence, while unexpected kindness opens doors. In 1945, a group of young women who had been trained to serve a murderous regime were given hot tea instead of humiliation. They never forgot the smell of that bread, the taste of that tea, or the look in the sergeant's tired eyes when he said, "No one's taking anyone's clothes off." Their story is not just an anecdote in a footnote, it is a parable about the transformative power of decency. Sometimes the nurse would sit with her granddaughter, a girl with quick eyes and more questions than the nurse had years left, and tell her about the camp. She would describe the smell of coal smoke, the taste of porridge, the fear that melted when a guard said, "Good morning." Her granddaughter would ask, "Were you scared?" And she would answer, "Yes, and brave. You can be both." When the girl learned about the Holocaust in school, she would return home troubled. The nurse would not excuse what her nation had done. She would nod, eyes clouding, and say, "Never forget," and never stop seeing the person on the other side. These conversations were her legacy, a transmission of nuance in a world that preferred simple villains and heroes. In telling her story, she refused to allow propaganda, from any side, to own her narrative. The knock at the door keeps coming, asking each generation how it will answer. In our own time, images and rumours travel faster than trains. Fear is still a tool wielded by those who would separate us from them. The women of the Nottingham camp, with their half-remembered English words and pressed flowers, speak across decades. They suggest that when confronted with the unknown, we might choose to listen instead of shouting, to offer bread instead of fists. They remind us that kindness is not weakness, that empathy can coexist with accountability, and that peace is built not only in treaties, but in everyday acts. Their story is a quiet plea to be wary of slogans that weaponize fear. It is a hymn to the capacity of ordinary people to subvert expectations through decency. The knock will not stop. How we answer will define us.